Many parents from across the country are giving provincial back-to-school strategies a failing grade. Ontario is the latest province to unveil its plans, and like other regions in Canada, kids will be able to return to classrooms full-time with some safety measures in place, but critics say it's not enough. So here's what we want to ask everyone. What would it take for you to feel comfortable sending your child back to school in September?
That's the million-dollar question, Jess. Listen, I think a lot of families are grappling with plans as they are starting to get released by each province. Yesterday, for us here in Ontario, part of the plan was released, and every family is going to have to make risk assessments and decisions based on their individual situations, because clearly no two families are going to be the same. Right. For my family, this plan falls short, and now I thought that my daughter would for sure be going back to school in September. And now I am really, really not so sure about that. So my personal situation and what I would do differently is maybe not going to be what my next door neighbor would do. For me, I'm thinking about my daughter's health. We keep hearing time and time again that health experts, doctors are saying this is turning into a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Well, for kids who are 12 and under, they're not eligible to be vaccinated yet, so they're vulnerable. So that's number one. Number two, I have elderly parents to think about and in-laws, but especially my parents because they are older. And so I have to think about them because Marqueza getting the sniffles or getting COVID at school is one thing. Her getting it, maybe even having a mild case, but giving it to my 80-year-old parents, it's a very different situation. Why? Because we keep hearing that waning immunity and effectiveness for those who are vaccinated, particularly those who are older, that's a real possibility. So now I'm playing public health expert. Like, so let me do the math. When do I think the immunity is going to reduce? And yes, Laine.
In what ways then? Like you said, this plan doesn't work for your family. So in what ways is it falling short for you?
It's really specific. I was looking for very clear things. I've been living my life according to all the guidelines. And the guidelines have always told us social distance, make sure that you're vaccinated, make sure that those around you are vaccinated to reduce your risk, make sure that there is masking of all of the ages, make sure that there's proper ventilation. So for me, the one thing I needed more than anything in yesterday's plan, at least here in Ontario, and I understand it doesn't seem like it's going to be mandated anywhere so far across the province, is reduced class sizes. It simply doesn't make sense that I've been told from day one, do not be congregating indoors with a lot of people, especially unvaccinated people, and think that that is safe 5 days a week. I still potentially could see a classroom of, 28 kids inside. I also didn't get any assurances of what is the outbreak protocol. Public health officials, that's their job. Teachers, their job is to teach. So far in Ontario, it's been told, teachers and schools, you figure that out.
So the Nova Scotia plan, the Nova Scotia plan has no cafeteria services, and kids will eat their lunches at their desk. Not to mention that there will be smaller class sizes, and that they hope that those classes end up bubbling together with just their teacher as time will allow. Is that something that certainly sounds like it's more positive? I guess.
Is that what they're funny cohorting, right?
You know what?
That's what they're calling.
Yeah,
cohorting?
It's a bit of a cohort. But I love Nova Scotia pointing out the lunchroom, because that is obviously the million-dollar question. Because even if you have a mask policy, and the mask policy, let's just say it extends, which it does in various provinces, to the outdoors, not every province, then you still have the lunchroom problem, especially as weather gets colder. And I just remember when I was growing up, and this is obviously way pre-pandemic, we sat at our desks at lunch. And somehow that, because there was no cafeteria room when we were in elementary school. So somehow that's been turfed out the window. That would be definitely something, like if I send Jaya back to an actual school, I would want to bring him home for lunch or insist that there's a change in the classroom. And you're right, Mel, the class sizes is a huge question mark. And also just the data. We don't know at this point how the Delta variant will impact kids. The messaging before was all around how young kids really aren't, in the majority of the times impacted as greatly as older people are when it comes to this pandemic. I don't know if that's the case anymore, because we're hearing more and more out of the US that they're seeing rise in pediatric hospitals with COVID cases. Now, that's mostly in areas where there's low public vaccination rates. So Canada is a little bit better off overall, but that depends province to province. That depends jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So I just want to read that Amira on Twitter said, as a mom of a grade 1 student, I'm nervous. He was virtual last year because no masks in kindergarten. As a teacher of grade 2 and 3 kiddos, I am nervous. The layers just don't make much sense. And Amira, thank you for sharing that. The one thing that keeps on crossing my mind is once we start to get into like actual cold and flu season, and I'm hearing from mothers who have their kids in like daycare right now, if a child comes down with like sniffles, which happens, they're immediately required to go get COVID tests, and then they're out until they can get that proof. So are we just going to end up pulling kids in and out throughout the year again, which was incredibly disruptive?
But that's not even required. It's not even that it's not required. There are zero guidelines as to exactly how the sniffles would work in a class. There's been, at least in Ontario, a reduced number of symptom list that, you know, if you do have the sniffles, that's not automatically going to mean you have to keep your child home, and that list has been reduced. But I just had a situation a few weeks ago. Marquesa is in camp, and they are mostly outdoors. It's the safer situation, very small sizes. It's comfortable enough. There's no such thing as zero risk, but I feel comfortable with this risk. And she came down with the nose congestion. And so right away, I pulled her. I went to go get a COVID test for her. She spent an afternoon with my mother. My mother came down with the same cold, but my mother is 80. It's now turned into a full-blown chest infection, and she's vaccinated. And it's not COVID. They both tested. Luckily, they are both negative. But that is the scenario. It's not necessarily only children, although that's my concern. It's not only children. It is who else are they in their lives dealing with and interacting with to keep safe. That's a big concern.
Yeah, I think that's why parents across the country are, like, they have concerns, not just in Ontario, but everywhere else. We're hearing from a lot of the parents who watch our show, including Sonia Rose from Ottawa, responding to the question, what would it take to send your kids back to school? Sonia says, smaller class sizes, like you said, Mel, distance will matter at lunchtime, real remediation for HVAC systems, vaccine mandates for adults in schools, at least full masking mandates indoors and at recess, and definitely no wind instruments, referring to extracurriculars and music classes coming back. And all of these, Sonia Rose, thank you, like, are, you know, people have a checklist, as probably most parents do. And many of the provinces, not just Ontario, but around the country, these back-to-school plans are not meeting a lot of these checklists. Like in BC, where I used to live, I have a lot of friends there who have the same concerns. There are a lot of people in BC who consider Ontario's just released back-to-school plan more cautious than theirs. And already it's been pointed out how many pitfalls there are in the Ontario plan. So imagine what's happening in BC. For starters, the plan in BC was developed according to documentation that came out in June before Delta cases started rising. So you're already working with a plan that's based on old information. So that's a concern. There isn't a recommendation for cohorting. Cynthia, you were talking about cohorting, and that's like the term for it. Cohorting is not recommended in BC. There's very little mention of HVAC ventilation upgrades. And I don't think that's the case in Ontario either. And that is, like, we're hearing, this is airborne. So, you know, it's not so much the surfaces and wiping them down. It's actually the air that's circulating indoors when the temperature starts to drop. All of these are concerns. And in BC, you know, I don't think this plan is adequate, like far from even the Ontario plan.
Well, here's a slightly different point of view from Lisa on Twitter. We're in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, and our numbers aren't bad, and my daughter is vaccinated, as are we. So going back to school is okay in my books. And Lisa, thanks for the comment. I think this sort of reflects the idea that there isn't a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. And right now, like in Ontario, I believe like today our numbers are 150, and they've been under 200 for the last 3 days. So for some parents who might not have the same situation as everyone. Mel, you were very eloquent in the way that you pointed that out, that every family's different. But for some parents, this is probably enough. And this is like a godsend for them. Just the fact that life has the chance of turning to some sort of approximate of normal.
I think that the lesson here is that, like, I think that the lesson here, I get it, that their daughter was vaccinated, which means their daughter's over 12 years old. But the lesson with COVID is that we can't look at ourselves as individuals. What affects the collective is going to affect the collective, right? And so one school situation may be one school situation, but one community situation is going to have a rebound effect everywhere else.